Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, coming to you from our studio in Washington, D.C. We're joined again by Eugene Jarecki, who's a public policy thinker, author of The American Way of War. Thanks for joining us, Eugene.
Thanks for having me.
So we left off talking about the sort of psychological side, or you can say cultural propagandistic side of the military-industrial complex. You were talking about the selling of the perfect security, and there's also decades of the selling of the perfect enemy, which goes back into whole Cold War psychology, and many people think mythology. How important is unraveling the Cold War to having a more rational policy towards industrial military issues now?
I hope it's important, because I've devoted most of the last 8 years of my life to trying to address just that, to make people think more closely about the past, because without an understanding of how we lost our way, you can't really figure out how to take the steps to go back. And of course, there is no going back. We've done such things in the world right now that we face the world we created in so many ways. And so life is made very difficult for someone like Barack Obama, who you may assume has in his heart of hearts the image of a really better world, the image of a better role for America in the world. And yet the world will close in on us, because we are not a country without a history. We're a country with a very complex history. Even the hero of my film and the hero of my book in many ways, Dwight Eisenhower, is responsible also for some much more shadowy deeds, like overthrowing the democratically elected leader of the country of Iran once upon a time in 1953, an event that the CIA said at the time would have repercussions. They called that blowback. Well, we've watched 50 years of blowback now emerge, not only in the conflicts we've had with Iran and the Islamic Revolution there, but of course in the full picture of what's happened in our involvement in the Middle East and the war we're now embroiled in Iraq.
Just yesterday, Barack Obama made a videotape, a message to the Iranian people and leaders, which I thought was, in my own opinion, a good way to put it. If it had been President Bush, it would have been a message to the Iranian people, excluding the leaders,
yes.
Which suggests a kind of discourse and perhaps a fresh new way of looking at it. On the other hand, during the election campaign, Barack Obama often rooted his foreign policy, and he would begin with Truman, the president who dropped nuclear weapons on Japan, and talked about the whole history of American pragmatic foreign policy as something that he found his own roots in, with Bush 2, term 1, being the aberration. Now, but is that really Obama's roots, or is this electioneering?
I don't think anyone knows what Obama really is yet. I think Obama, the one thing we know about him is that he's a phenomenal and huge human being with a huge amount of gift and a huge amount of potential. And where that potential will go is a question, and I think world events will affect that, the content of his heart and character will affect that, and of course, most importantly, those who surround him and the advice they give him. Presidents are awfully isolated people, and they ultimately breathe in and consume what is made most readily available to them. And so one of my fears is, who are the people who are advising Obama? And are they telling him the real lessons of Eisenhower? For example, we've heard a lot about Lincoln, and we've heard a lot about Reagan. We've heard a lot about former leaders who I think have mixed lessons to provide to us. Eisenhower has a very loud and clear message. I'm a general. I then became a president. I saw firsthand what battle looks like and its costs, the incredible damaging costs of war. And I then saw what it was like to be a president and to understand that the forces that are guiding war policy are often very corrupt and far from what the public thinks they are. And that if you're not careful, the dish can run away with the spoon, and a country can pursue this kind of perfect security at great expense to itself, far greater than the threat ever was. Eisenhower famously said at the time that you can destroy from within what you are trying to protect from without.
And there's a new argument developing from some of the armaments manufacturers. There's a fight taking place right now on renewal of the F-22, whether it's a needed plane or not. And the campaign being waged by its manufacturer is not that the enemy is so bad, it's that the F-22 creates jobs, and the issue of in this economic crisis, militarization is a good thing for the economy.
Sure. I mean, I talk greatly about the F-22 in my book. There's almost a whole chapter dedicated to it, because the F-22 is such a case study in the misguidedness of American, not just American defense procurement, what weapons systems we buy and invest in. That's ludicrous. I mean, the F-22 at this point has cost $70 billion. For your viewers to know, it's an air-to-air combat aircraft. That means it's a plane that we use to shoot down other planes. We don't have an enemy with an air force. So when you're in an economic collapse, as we are in right now, and you wonder, are we spending money on good things, and you're buying planes to fight wars that are not available to us today, you have to ask yourself, why is that plane still in production? The reason it's still in production is that the makers of the F-22, like the makers of so many defense systems and other American products, are not stupid. They engineer support in Congress for their program. The way they do that is very insidious. I can talk about it, but it's one of the great shortcomings of our democracy today, the sort of engineering of our democracy toward absolutely mindless decisions about defense that are simply profitable for the few at the expense of the many.
Now, in Barack Obama's speech to Congress, and he actually did get a standing ovation for this sentence, whether some of those people standing really want it to happen, we'll find out. He said we're going to stop making and paying for weapon systems that came out of an earlier age that we no longer need. So take that another step forward. If you were talking about, concerned about the advice Obama is receiving, but if he asked you for advice, what are the steps he should take to start unraveling this whole militarization of America?
There are two things that I think need to be done to shut down the influence of the defense industrial sector on our public policy, but more broadly on our corporate sector on public policy. The first of those is to make illegal the practice by which makers of planes like the F-22 and other systems curry favor in Congress. And the way they do that is something called political engineering. As you may know, the B-2 bomber has a piece of it made in every single U.S. state. Now, I only took Economics 101 in high school, but something tells me that is not a very intelligent way to make a product. You would want to make as much of it under one roof as you could, so that you use one air conditioning system, one insurance policy, one everything. Instead, when you see that they are not only not making them under one roof, but that weapons makers are trying to make their products under as many rooms in as many congressional districts as possible, you ask why? Why? So that when that plane, the F-22 or another plane, comes up for review in Congress, and you're trying to see, could we kill this system or not, you find it impossible to kill the system because everybody's getting a piece of the action.
And hopefully on the part of the arms manufacturer, someone might lose a job in every district in the nation.
That's how they threaten it. And they make maps. There are maps made by the defense industrial corporations in this country, and those maps are flaunted in front of those in Congress.
So specifically, what would you do to break that? How do you stop
Make it illegal. Political engineering should be illegal in America. It's not complicated. That's like saying that, well, we run a capitalist system, it's based on free enterprise, we should all be able to compete, but of course if you can get rich enough, you should be able to rig the system with money so that you don't have to compete anymore. That's the end of free enterprise. So if you really want to have a free market system, you cannot allow political engineering to continue. How would you do that? The government would say to a contractor who wants to have their plane stay in production, and they would put them through a contract review process and see, you're taking taxpayer money, how are you spending it? Are you spending it efficiently, or are you spending it to keeping the money spigot open? In other words, are you spending it in all these districts because it's good for Americans and good for their security and getting bang for their buck?
You said there were two
That's
things.
the first thing. The other thing I would do is a fundamental issue about campaign finance. Basically, a congressperson has two jobs in this country. One is to bring jobs to their district, and the other is to get money in at campaign time to be able to say, I'm the one who brought the jobs. So the political engineering, that deals with the bribery of bringing jobs to your district. So that's one way you can cut that cord. And then with campaign finance, of course, if you had public elections, as you have in other westernized democracies, you wouldn't have the problem of this kind of corruption. They don't have this in Germany. They don't have this in England. They don't have this in France. Perfectly normal countries, just like we are, with schools and healthcare and all those other things that they strive for, and yet they don't have such an extraordinarily disproportionate part of their national wealth going into one sector at such great cost to the health of the state.
Now some people argue the reason Europe doesn't have it is because the U.S. does, and they kind of ride the American military gravy train.
I've heard that. I don't think that stands to reason. I think what they're really trying to do is find, if you keep coming up with excuses for something, somebody has to say, well, you must have a reason to be generating excuses. The European countries have plenty of problems, plenty of challenges, plenty of international crises that they're facing, and somehow they don't have these same problems that we have. They have their own problems, and they can deal with those. What I'm dealing with is, why did a military-industrial complex at the level that we have it, where we spend more on defense in this country than all other countries in the world combined, why is that special to the United States? And I would argue it has to do with a vulnerability of our representative republic system
but doesn't it also,
to that kind of gameplay.
No, this is probably, the two things are probably connected with each other, because certainly the military sector doesn't just lobby on the economic side, they also push and lobby on the foreign policy side itself and the objective side. But doesn't that also need to change? That's the fundamental assumption that the U.S. must maintain its dominance in terms of global politics.
I don't really care that much about that, because honestly the Congress people only go along with the war-making decisions because it's directly been made beneficial for them to do so. And this is a more complicated, in other words, so if you were a military maker and you wanted to provoke war, well, Congress people have a tremendous political cost associated with war decisions. And so they only take them not because necessarily they're doing it for spiritual reasons. They take it largely because they want to keep the jobs flowing to the district, the money flowing to their campaign coffers. If you cut those umbilical cords, now you will restore much more of a real and balanced cost-benefit analysis to the process by which a congressperson appraises, should we go to war in Iraq, should we ratchet up in Afghanistan, should we start conducting strikes in Pakistan. These kind of questions are right now being influenced by the side benefit of jobs and money. If you take that side benefit out, you won't absolutely purify the decision, but you'll go a long way.
What else would you suggest to President Obama on this whole front?
Well, I would implore President Obama to look at the way in which a figure like Eisenhower compares to a figure like the civilians who misguided us in the past 8 years. Once upon a time, it was Clemenceau who said war should not be left to the generals. And that idea was an idea that generals are somehow trigger happy. If you leave it up to them, we'll be at war all the time. I'm not sure there's any evidence for that. And in fact, in the last 8 years, we had the world brought to one of the most dangerous points we've witnessed in our human history, and that was done by civilians. It was done by civilians who told generals to shut up when they spoke up, like General Shinseki, who was laughed off the podium when he suggested that it might take hundreds of thousands of men to pacify Iraq, and a civilian like Donald Rumsfeld thought he was in a position to speak otherwise. And of course, history has proven who was right in that debate. And so I would ask President Obama to understand that the civilian-military balance needs to be improved, needs to be restored to some measure of sanity, where military voices and their vision of what it might be like to ratchet up in Afghanistan, what kind of exit strategy you could ever have from that country, what benefit you might procure from conducting strikes in Pakistan that are killing civilians, what those risks are. There is an enormously uncharted risk factor involved in this kind of escalation, particularly for Barack Obama, who is seen by the world as a chance for America to conduct itself differently. So there has to be a huge benefit for him to betray the hopes of the world. And I don't think he would get a suggestion of that benefit if he talked to people in uniform who have a sober assessment of the possibilities ahead.
In the next segment of our interview, let's talk about the advice he's getting, the interests of the Pentagon as it comes to Iraq, because there's a real question about, does the Pentagon, or at least sections of the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex, really want out of Iraq? And what might that mean for the Obama administration?
Sure.
Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Eugene Jarecki. Endless wars, abuse of powers, declining living standards, and the climate change crisis. The stakes couldn't be greater in the U.S. And with your help, we're moving our news operation to Washington, D.C. We'll focus on money and corruption. For example, big oil and arms companies shape American economic and foreign policy with far-reaching effects on the lives of ordinary people. With allies in government, trade unions, the media, and in think tanks, they're a hidden hand that controls the commanding heights of American politics. Taking on the industrial military complex is what real change requires. Even former presidents and high administration officials have said so. But corporate television news treats such positions as marginal. Uncompromising journalism requires questioning assumption, interrogating structures of wealth and power. Corporate TV news just won't do it. Only a news organization that's truly independent can tackle such issues with courage and tenacity. And we'll take on corporate TV news live. You'll watch TV news with our panel of writers, journalists, scientists, and historians. You'll be able to join in by phone, webcam, chat. Together we'll discuss and debate what's the real story and take on the myth and the propaganda. But this is only possible if you support us now. We need to prove that a viewer-funded model works. So if you want the real news, we need you now. Please click on the donate button and give generously. Now's the time to decide if you want the real news to thrive.
Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute at therealnews.com.